With the final season of Game of Thrones wrapping up, a collection of YouTube creators I admire decided to put together a series of videos showcasing their favorite episodes. They're calling it the Best of Thrones, and I decided to join in on the celebration of the nearly decade-long TV series. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell so that you never miss this or any other big screen theory. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, now cue that opening theme. There was an episode this season where I actually believed Game of Thrones might be transitioning from a grimdark, or should I say grimdark, show into one embracing hope punk. One where all the show's heroes, or at least the ones that we've come to identify as such despite all the horrendous acts some of them have committed, came together to dwell in each other's company and enjoy the calm before the storm. What the heck is grimdark and hope punk, you might say? Well, before we continue, let's define some of these terms I'm throwing out there for you folks who might not know what I'm talking about. Essentially, they are subgenres and literary terms. Grimdark is a style or tone of storytelling that wallows in cynicism, thriving in amoral dystopias and violent aesthetics. Its credo is pretty much no good deed goes unpunished, and those that dare to do the honorable thing are subject to much suffering. The wicked, on the other hand, are rewarded for their scheming and malevolence, and no matter what, show no mercy. It is pretty much the philosophy that Game of Thrones has lived by for its entire run. Martin himself has spoken numerous times about his approach, and the desire to inject gritty realism into the fantasy realm.
A lot of fantasy that concerns itself with the battle of good and evil. And I think the battle of good and evil is a terrific subject for fiction. But I don't think it's fought between really good-looking guys in white cloaks on white horses and really ugly guys in black armor who smell bad, as in too much fantasy. I think it's fought within the individual human heart. I've always been attracted to gray characters. That's what I try to write, because I think those are real characters. Those are real human beings.
And while hope punk would appear to stand in direct contrast of this trend, it itself isn't bereft of conflict and struggle. On the contrary, it's actually considered weaponized optimism, a phrase coined by a Vox article about the storytelling style. In the article, it cites writer Alexandra Rowland as the inventor of the title, having declared it in a 2-sentence Tumblr post in 2017. The opposite of grimdark is hope punk. Pass it on. But while hope punk is the opposite of grimdark, it also differs from the other often cited idealistic tone known as noble bright, which posits that good exists and is worth fighting for, and it is a fight that can be won definitively and conclusively. It's essentially the trope and storytelling approach that says evil can be vanquished forever and we can live happily ever after. This style is something we all grew up with and know very well. Think stuff like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings if you're looking for a direct parallel to Game of Thrones. Rowland further expanded upon her devising of the term hope punk in an essay for the Festive Ninja website, an indie publisher that specializes in role-playing games which embrace the hope punk ideology. She explained that hope punk also embraces the idea of hope and believing there is good in the world, and yes, it's worth fighting for, but it will require resistance and rebellion and rage. It will be an everlasting fight, and it will not be nice. She closes her essay emphasizing how messy, while absolutely necessary, this fight will be. Hope punk isn't pristine and spotless. Hope punk is grubby, because that's what happens when you fight. It's hard, it's filthy, sweaty, back-breaking work that never ends. It isn't pretty, and it isn't noble, and it isn't nice. There are no heroes and no villains. There are just people. Whether the glass is half full or half empty, what matters is that there's water in that glass, and that's something worth defending. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting one approach is objectively better than the other. There's a place for grimdark stories, where that particular style is just the right fit. And I've been a big fan of material one might categorize as grimdark in many instances. The post-apocalyptic subgenre wouldn't exist without it. But I do believe a balance can be struck, and hope punk seems the best suited to provide that equilibrium. One just has to look at the evolution of the Mad Max franchise from Road Warrior to Fury Road to see how an injection of hope punk can revitalize a series. With all that said, and in light of how the final season of Game of Thrones has developed, it's obvious I wasn't entirely right about the show taking a more hopeful turn. Although I guess the ending does have some underlying hope punk notes. I don't know, I think I need more time to digest it fully. But I think it's still worth revisiting an episode that hinted at the more optimistic aesthetic. to look at what it did right and examine what it promised for its characters. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. This was the second episode of the 8th and final season of the show. It served as the prologue to the centerpiece battle with the White Walkers. Written by Brian Cogman, a veteran of the series, he's been with the show from the very first season, so who better to write what feels like a farewell episode than a writer who's inhabited these characters for almost 10 years. It was the last episode for the show he would write, so Cogman was also saying goodbye to Westeros himself. He was one of several writers tasked with developing a spin-off for HBO, the only one handpicked by George R.R. Martin himself to pitch one, but the network ultimately chose not to order his idea to series. Director David Nutter helmed this episode, along with 2 others in this final season. He's also a vet of the series, having directed multiple episodes of the show in its 2nd, 3rd, and 5th seasons. He's also the first director to win an Emmy for his work on the series. And at this point, it goes without saying that the acting in this and every Game of Thrones episode is fantastic. From the smallest of parts, like Lyanna Mormont, played by Bella Ramsey, and Daniel Portman as Pod the Rod, to the lead cast. The performances are impeccable. So let's break down this episode. Dany and her army have arrived in Winterfell and are acclimating to the cold, harsh land of the north, along with dealing with its people's distrust of them. Jon has reunited with his Stark family, Sansa and Arya and Bran. Oh, and did I mention the Kingslayer showed up in town? While Sansa and Dany discuss how they're going to execute him, Brienne stands up for Jaime and insists that he be allowed to fight alongside them against the incoming threat of the Night King and White Walkers. The moment of mercy and camaraderie is our first indication that things are different in this episode of Game of Thrones. All involved agreed to allow the Kingslayer to live and fight with the North. This moment of cooperation over conflict in order to achieve a greater good is one of the pillars of Hope Punk, and the first example of its influence seeping into this episode. From there, we watch each of the characters engage in their own individual reunions and reconciliations. Bran and Jaime come to an understanding about both their places in the world now. Jaime and Tyrion discuss the mistakes they've made and how to move forward, and Sansa comes to a meeting of the minds with Dany as they take the smallest of steps towards compromise and balance, although it does reach an impasse. This again exemplifies a tenet in Hope Punk that speaks to the impermanence of the happy ending and its perpetually moving goalposts. We don't get to see how they would have dealt with this standoff because it's interrupted by the arrival of Theon to Winterfell. He receives a heartfelt welcome from Sansa that he does not expect, and this outpouring of emotion by both parties seems to surprise Dany. These scenes all contain elements of Hope Punk, with the last one showcasing the strength of allowing emotions to be seen and felt. As Rowland says in her expanded definition, crying is also Hope Punk, because crying means you still have feelings, and feelings are how you know you're alive. We even get a chance to visit with Missandei and Grey Worm, fully aware of the hostility the people of the North harbor towards them, not just because they are part of Dany's entourage, but of them individually. Looking nothing like the Northerners, they are met with wary gazes and suspicious silence. The two lovers look to the future though, when they will leave this land together for a better life elsewhere. It is a sweet dream, if only serving as a temporary reprieve from the forthcoming nightmare. Then we have the case of Arya's arc in this episode. She meets with both the Hound and Gendry, coming to very different conclusions for each. She and Clegane reflect on their past together, and why each of them have chosen the bloody paths they have. Arya's growth in this episode goes beyond killers reminiscing about killing. She also gets an opportunity to have more in her life than just death. Arya and Gendry start the episode continuing their flirtatious ribbing of one another until their thinly veiled attraction is finally consummated. And so we get the rarest of things in a Game of Thrones episode, a positive and consensual sexual encounter. Despite the sense of the impending doom that permeates this episode, seeing all these characters interact with one another somehow manages to conjure up feelings of hope. Again, we get reunions and reconciliation. For these brief moments, we get a sense that maybe things could turn out alright. The most powerful moment of the episode is of course the knighting of Brienne of Tarth. You can't help but feel your heart swell at the sight of this character. One we've watched fight valiantly and honorably with all her being throughout the series, finally received the acceptance and affirmation she has so richly deserved. For her, the act of being knighted by Sir Jaime is especially significant, as it becomes quite clear she's grown to have great affection for this man. It's a simple sequence where our characters drink and converse around a fire that turns into something grander as Brienne's knighthood is bestowed upon her. This relatively short section of the show's 58-minute runtime punctuates the powerful themes that Hope Punk can instill, coming together and progressing forward as the light of hope keeps us warm from the cold, all while the specter of the next battle lingers not too far off. The night is dark and full of terrors, yes, but the darkness can be pushed back. No matter how grim our stories are,
whether of war, struggle, heartache, or even a song of ice and fire. They can all be illuminated by the cinders of kindness, friendship, and hope, with an atom of justice and a molecule of mercy. This was how Game of Thrones embraced Hope Punk for an episode, and why it was the best of Thrones. Thanks for watching, everybody. Let me know what you thought about the episode, and what you think about Hope Punk in general, and which episode do you think is the best of Thrones? Let me know in the comments down below. Check out the Best of Thrones playlist to see all the other videos in the series. I'll also include links to all the articles I mentioned in my video in the description, so give those a read too. Be sure to hit like, and if you're enjoying what we're doing here, maybe give our Patreon page a browse and support us there too. And until next time...
Yes, all Lannisters are lions, and when a Tyrell farts, it smells like a rose.